everyone, and welcome to the Surgical Ergonomics podcast, where we will be discussing everything related to surgical and procedural ergonomics, the people, ideas, and technology that will help enhance your physical wellness and career longevity. I am your host, Geeta Lal. I'm an academic endocrine surgeon, speaker, consultant, and surgical ergonomics coach. Having experienced work-related musculoskeletal injury myself, I am committed to increasing awareness of and developing solutions to counteract the impact of poor ergonomics on the professional and personal lives of healthcare workers in procedural areas. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Surgical Ergonomics podcast. In today's episode of the podcast, I am very pleased to have as our guest Dr. Sarah Temkin. She is a director and producer, a first-time filmmaker, and was actually trained as a gynecologic oncologist who spent over 2 decades providing surgical and medical care for women with cancer of the female genital tract. She has held leadership positions in academic medicine, has served on multiple national committees, and is widely published in the medical literature. Sarah has contributed throughout her career to conversations about equity in healthcare, including gender equity within the physician workforce. She was inspired to make the award-winning short documentary film 1001 Cuts, informed by her lived experience after leaving clinical practice in 2020. Sarah, welcome, and it's great to have you here today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me here. I'm so pleased.
Well, for the listeners of our podcast, I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about your journey, for example, where you did your training and how you landed up at your current role.
Yeah, so thanks again for having me here. I think it's such an opportunity to talk to the surgeons that are interested in ergonomics about the film. I trained as a gynecologic oncologist, and I think my professional journey was informed by the first time I walked into an operating room, which was just such an overwhelming and special place, and it was terrifying. And then the second time that I walked in and the third, and I was like, this is so amazing that people can go into an operating room, the patient, and then come out and have whatever problem it was that they had be fixed. And so when I was a medical student in the 1990s, when I started saying like, oh, maybe I'm interested in surgery, a lot of people responded in ways that I thought was sort of interesting, which really stuck with me throughout my career. You know, people would say things like, oh, that's adorable that you want to be a surgeon. And I was like, I'm being really serious. I don't totally understand this. And in any case, I think it was suggested to me that maybe OBGYN might be a more reasonable career choice for a woman. And, you know, I walked into operating rooms and thought that it looked like surgery. And I ended up in an OBGYN residency and then really drawn to the surgical part of OBGYN, which was at the time really gynecologic oncology. And I'm just so thankful for the time that I had as a surgeon and clinician taking care of women. But I think it also gave me a little bit of a unique perspective in that when I was training before my fellowship, and even when I started my fellowship, gynecologic oncology was like predominantly made up of men. There were very few women in the field. And because of the shift in the demographics of the OBGYN community, by the time that I stopped practicing, the field was actually majority women. And so, you know, I got to sort of have this first front row view on what happens when the demographics of a profession change very drastically and dramatically. Because in the beginning of my career, I was like, I guess I didn't necessarily think of myself as being any different than the men that were doing the same job as me. And so a lot of that experience of going from just doing my job as a surgeon and then experiencing discrimination and then having people at the end of my career be like, but you're surrounded by women, really, you know, gave me this viewpoint that I really wanted to share. In 2020, during the pandemic, I stopped practicing like many other women. And I think I just had reached sort of my lifetime maximum of having arguments with hospital administrators that I
Mhm.
didn't see my male colleagues having to go through. I think I loved surgery and the OR so much, and I felt like I owed it to the patients that I took care of and to the community to sort of create a document about what
Mhm.
my experience had been and why I wasn't going to be there anymore.
Right, right. Well, it is a phenomenal film, and thank you for sharing your journey. I have to tell our listeners that it was actually during the pandemic that I saw clips of your film. And I think that was around the same time, 2020, 2021, when I had been thinking about delving further into ergonomics. And that was at the time that I actually then started with, putting together a curriculum for residents because all of a sudden we actually had a little bit of time, right? A little bit of breathing room.
Yeah,
And I remember coming across this clip. I followed several of the surgeons that were in the documentary on social media anyway. And so I was intrigued. And I remember listening to this clip where several of the surgeons indicated how they didn't feel like they belonged in surgery because nothing in the OR seemed to be made for a female surgeon. And
yeah,
that actually resonated with me in terms of where I was with my own mindset at the time. I'm like, it's true. It's not just me. I'm struggling with ergonomics, and these women are talking about the same thing. And for our listeners, I'll have to let you know that I didn't think at that time that I would ever have a chance to meet you because we were just seeing snippets of the film during the pandemic. And then I was so happy to have a chance to meet with you and interact with you as a part of the Society of Surgical Ergonomics Industry Collaborations Committee when we did the webinar in December of 2024 as it pertained to surgical staplers and what the issues are related to them. And that's where we kind of played that clip from your film where the women surgeons talked about this issue. For our listeners, I will enclose, in the show notes, that particular clip, but also a link to the whole film for people that are interested. They can reach out to your distributor or you, and if they're interested in screening, the film for themselves and their colleagues. But I wondered, was this something, Sarah, that you set out to explore, or is this something like the parts pertaining to surgical ergonomics? Did they just kind of
yeah.
come about organically as you were making this film documenting kind of your, I should say, ode to your surgical career and the reasons you were leaving?
Well, I'll tell you, I have so many things to say in response to that. The first
Please
one,
do.
yeah, I mean, the first thing is I want to just respond to something that you said about like not really realizing the that like part of the issue with ergonomics was having a female body, because
Yeah.
like I'll tell you that having sat through, I don't know, a lot of screenings of the film and watching people's reactions,
Mhm.
even someone who is in the film after the first time that she saw it said to me like, I never thought about the instruments before. And
Mm.
so we're so like
Wow.
acclimated
Yeah.
to, and actually another person said it who said it to me was a department chair, and
Mm.
she is older, a little older than me, probably in her mid or late 60s, and said the same thing, like I never thought about the instruments. And
Mhm.
so I think it goes to show you how, especially women, but the entire surgical culture, we just get indoctrinated and like
Mhm.
we're going to do it with like these are the tools, we're going to do it the way that we were taught, we're going to maybe question authority, but also just we're going to be tougher than whatever it is that is in front of us, and we don't even really notice that. I don't know if that was your experience, but I found that to be really remarkable.
I think you're 110% right on that because I think you and I trained in the same time. I was a medical student in the early 90s. I started my residency in
Yeah.
1995, and the mindset was you've got to be better. You can't complain because you've got to show that you can hack this. Otherwise, you're going to be out and then they'll never let another woman in a surgical program again,
Yeah,
right? Like you were
exactly.
carrying that weight. I remember that I was at that time in a diverse city in a diverse program, but I was the only woman of Indian origin in that surgical program, right?
Right.
So whether it was conscious or subconscious, I think mostly subconscious, but once in a while it struck me that, man, if I fail, they're never letting another Indian chick into
Yeah.
the program, right?
Yeah.
So I think you're, as I said, 110% correct. We were just going to do our jobs and do it better and not complain. And, the instrumentation was far away from a lot of the other things we had to worry about on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I think we just are like stubborn and driven and we want to, there's an immediate problem, which is I think what we like about surgery, that there's a patient who has a need, that you're going to fix it. And so all of the other stuff, sort of becomes secondary and sort of fades into the background. Whereas like if we, speaking of being the only woman or being one of very few women, at that time, if 1 in 6 women left a surgical program, but it was only 5% of the surgical trainees were women, it didn't impact the whole profession the way that it does today, right?
Yeah.
Today, if half of the trainees in surgical programs are women,
Exactly.
and 20% of them are not able to survive because the equipment doesn't fit or because there's they're being harassed because of their gender or there's some other structural issue that makes them unable to be successful despite being smart, dedicated, talented, then that's a loss. That's it. That becomes a very big loss for the entire community and for our patients. And and then to your other question, I think like so I probably fell a little bit more into that group of people who didn't really think that much about the
Okay.
equipment before I started making the film.
Mm-hmm.
But part of the journey of making the film was talking to a lot of surgeons, which was just an incredible privilege because people were just so generous with their time. And I think it's a reflection of how much women want to tell their stories.
Story. Mm-hmm.
And this was like a real theme that
Mm-hmm.
over and over again, people were talking about the equipment not being the right size for them or them having been told like to do forearm exercises so that they could get their hands around, staple with one hand, whereas that person's 5 feet tall. It's never going to ergonomically work for her to do that. Like the stapler was not made for her.
Right. And this is the thing that I think you've heard. I've probably heard, well, I shouldn't say I've probably heard various things, but I've definitely heard that stapler line and needing to work out because I couldn't close the stapler with one hand. And I'm not a small woman by any means.
Yeah.
And it's disheartening because you work out. I did work out, and then I still couldn't close the stapler. And only when I started to delve into the ergonomics literature that I realized, and for those of our listeners who are maybe just joining, this surgical ergonomics podcast or just starting to listen to it, I would encourage you to listen to our first episode with Dr. Susan Hallbeck in addition to this one. If
Yeah.
you're
She has
particularly, yeah,
amazing data.
yeah,
Yeah.
if you're interested in this topic, particularly as it relates to, gender equity, is that, I mean, there is so much data out there now showing that the stapler designs are such, at least the first generation stapler designs were such that there was no way women were going to be able to generate the same amount of force that it takes to close the stapler as would be generated by a larger hand, which usually happens to be that of a man, because the span of the stapler handle was generally at the extremes of what would be kind of an average woman's hand span. And when you're at the extremes of that hand span, you just cannot generate that same amount of force. And in keeping with that, if you look at the literature, it doesn't matter now which specialty you look at. First, there were like these isolated small groups of women, small studies, commenting on this. But a couple of years ago, there's a meta-analysis published which kind of looked at all the data regarding women and surgical instruments and ergonomics. And it didn't matter which specialty you were in, just being a female was an important risk factor for work-related musculoskeletal injury among surgeons. Whether you looked at gynecologists, whether you looked at orthopedic surgeons, whether you
Yeah.
looked at general surgeons, gynecologists, it did not matter. And, with that in mind, it really is a huge kind of, I think, diversity, equity, and inclusion issue. It's not just about men and women. It's basically if you didn't fit the standard mold of a surgeon, right? Because you can have Asian surgeons, and I've noticed this when I give talks, they'll say, well, I know Geeta, you're talking about women surgeons, but my hand size is the same as a North American woman, and I'm a male from, I'm an Asian male.
Yeah.
I have the same issue with the staplers that are designed, in North America or Europe. So really, if you do not fit kind of the whatever the standard size is or standard hand anthropometrics are or body anthropometrics are, you're going to struggle. And it's not just the staplers. Other sort of instruments that are, I should say, frequent flyers when it comes to work-related injury among surgeons, endoscopes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And they're heavy sometimes too.
Yeah,
And I don't know why in my head I'm thinking about like how, you were trained to like palm a clamp. And
exactly.
there are
Yeah.
people whose hands are just not big enough. So I would say it's not even a DEI issue. It's like these are practical concerns
Hmm.
where it doesn't make sense. And I just have one of the surgeons from the film in my head right now saying, and where she says like we make all these accommodations for different sizes and shapes of patients,
Hmm.
and why aren't we doing that for surgeons, right? It just so happens that women more are more likely to be outside of that what was always considered the normal size of a
Exactly.
surgeon than men. But absolutely, it's an issue for everyone, and that's part of I don't know that I got this across in the film, but I wanted to make this point that like when we when we create environments that are good for more than one shape or size of human being, it's actually good for it's good for everybody. It doesn't have to be it's we don't have to be excluding people by inviting more people or making things more usable to a larger number of people. I don't know.
Absolutely, 100% and more. I agree with that. And that's why I also in this last, couple of seconds made that point, right? It just so happens
Yeah.
that women surgeons happen to have smaller hands and we're talking about women surgeons, but really it's, anyone who doesn't fit the norm, right? It could be
Yeah.
you have different anthropometrics and so it doesn't, kind of work that way. Now, along the same lines, when we did that webinar, right, we had some industry representation, and I'll include the links to that webinar on the Society of Surgical Ergonomics homepage as well, so people can kind of delve into kind of the nitty-gritty there if they're interested. Have you had interactions with industry folks about this aspect of the film, and in your own kind of clinical career? And if so, what sort of conversations have you had? What sort of impact did you see?
Yeah. I mean, so again, like I'm tall and I'm also like not a small person, so I always kind of made do with things. But as I got more senior and trained more residents and I had to watch sometimes people who were very small try to use some of these instruments, like I did start to bring this up inside institutions and like with device representatives and like, my smaller residents can't get her hand around this. And so a lot of reaction to that, I think, really stuck with me and then translated into something in the film, which was like people would kind of roll their eyes at me sometimes when I would say that. And I don't know if that's been your experience or not. The reason that this became sort of such a prominent issue in the film is because as women were telling me the story as I was putting this documentary together, it was so emotional for people to have not have had equipment that fit, right? It made them feel as though there was something wrong with them,
Hmm. Hmm.
which, like I had people with tears down their face just talking about like needing a stool in the operating room. And and that to me, that was a part of this that I felt like we have to have a conversation about this. And in my own experience, it was hard for me as a woman, even if it was me being like trying to advocate for my trainees, to get traction on the
Hmm.
issue. I don't know if that's sort of what your experience was or is. I think people are a little bit more open to it today.
I agree. So initially, I don't think there was as much traction, but in the last 4 or 5 years, obviously entering the pandemic and then, now 5 years later, I think more attention is given in general to the DEI kind of implications and issues surrounding this particular thing. Plus, I think being part of the Society of Surgical Ergonomics and kind of helping to focus on this issue, you brought people to the table that were already interested. I think we do see more willingness on part of industry to have these conversations because now you have people that are design engineers or human factors experts in industry who are actually wanting this kind of feedback because they see the value in it as well,
Yeah.
right? As you said, in having this more than just, having things fit more than just one type of body anthropometrics. So I do think there is a shift, but I think we have a long, long way to go. Regarding that thing that you mentioned about the emotion, I'm not surprised because if you think about it, like you're having to fight battles every day that maybe you don't see your male colleagues fighting. And this is just one more of those 1001 cuts, right? Where you are made to feel that you really shouldn't be in that operating room. It kind of feeds into that imposter syndrome that none of this was designed for you. You can't even figure out a comfortable way to do the job that you really want to do, that you're passionate about.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing is like in this there were several people who said things to me about this. It's like it's always in the beginning of the case where you have to deal with this equipment issue that's like not the right size or shape or needing a stool or the settings not being right or the bed not being
Hmm.
positioned
Hmm.
correctly for you. And
Hmm.
it sort of it sets up the whole case, right? Like it
Hmm.
sets up the tone of the case where like, oh, there she goes again asking for something like, who does she
Right.
think she is? And that's something, that's part of this larger dynamic at play. It's tiring to have
Right.
that happen. I mean, it does, like, at least for me, I always really I'm a little introverted, but I always wanted like quiet time before
Hmm.
the
Hmm.
case started. Like I always wanted to be the only person at the scrub sink, right? Like so that I could just like have my 5 seconds to think through, visualize what I wanted to get done. And you don't want the case to start with like some tension around something that's outside of your control.
Yeah. No, I think now I realize there's another reason you and I connected. I am still the same way. I want to be alone at the scrub sink, in my own thoughts, center myself, and then kind of, enter after a sterile scrub. I felt actually that title, I must say, when I first saw those clips, I was like, yes, this is yet another cut to remind you that you don't belong. And I will say that the focus of your documentary was obviously a gender-based one, but the hierarchy doesn't help, right? I think if we talk to our residents, male or female, I mean, if you think about it, none of them feel comfortable asking for us to adjust, maybe the table height for them or get them a different instrument. I mean, they also have that, it's the culture of surgery. You suck it up and you deal with it, until you can't anymore.
Yeah. No, I know. I mean, and some of that's good. I don't want all of that to go, I
Yeah,
don't want all of that to go away. That's like how we push ourselves and that's how we learn and we all want to
yeah,
strive for excellence, right? And you can't do that without feedback, but we also have to be sort of aware of what's like reasonable and what's
yeah.
not reasonable, right? I'll just add one thing, like just because the film has been shown to, mainly general audiences, like
Sure.
not physician, not healthcare trained, and like the equipment piece of it is like the audience sometimes will gasp at like some of these images,
Are you
because
serious?
yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
like they don't from a general population like perspective, people are like, what is happening here? Why are people on 3 and 4 steps? And like, why hasn't there been a better, why haven't we innovated a better way of creating space at a OR table at a patient's bedside so
Mm,
that we can have people of different heights and some of the like the gowns and the gloves, right? These are all they're each individually a very small thing that in aggregate starts to really wear people out, I think.
yeah. It's funny how well, what you just said reminded me of a couple of other things, right? So when you said the general audience gasped, it reminded me actually, there was somewhat of a similar reaction when I first went to the surgical services subcommittee, at our institution to kind of discuss this issue at the invitation of one of the surgical chairs. And after the fact, I had conversations with several different people in various levels of administration, both men and women, and they all kind of said, I said, they were flabbergasted that surgeons were in pain, uh,
Yeah,
and operating while in pain because, as they said, I don't want my surgeon to be in pain. I want them to be able to focus on doing my surgery safely and well and not have to worry about these things. So I can see how you might have had that reaction. Now it kind of, I think I understand how that might have occurred.
yeah,
Yeah, I will say for our listeners, it just reminded me, as I said, of two things. So one was that our administrative folks' reaction, and the second was, I know that Sarah and I mentioned kind of reaching out to industry. Now, when we talk to our quote unquote industry reps when we're in the OR, when we have feedback on instruments, we have to remember that these are the sales reps who we are talking to at the end, right? They're the ones that are in our OR. They're not the ones responsible for the design of the instrument and for its testing before it comes on market, right? The usability testing. So if you have that kind of feedback to offer, you need to have your sales rep give you the names or put you in touch with those companies that company's design team, their human factors expert. If they don't know who those are, there's usually a physician liaison for every company, right? Who manages physician relations. That's the person you need to start with so you can actually give this kind of feedback very early in the design phase because it's really hard to make even what we think as seemingly small
right.
tweaks when the instrument is already on market, right? We might
Yeah,
think it's move a button from here to there, but as we learned in that webinar on staplers, it's not so straightforward.
right. Well, I think one of the things I also wanted to convey in the film was about how we are a relatively new phenomenon in the grand scheme of medicine, right? It's
Yeah.
only been since 1972 that quotas on women in medicine were
Hmm.
lifted and that we were expected to get an education
Right.
and generally, right? Of course, there are the women that came before us and they were absolute pioneers, but our generation's a little different in that there were no longer restrictions on education, but the same is true in engineering, right? And so bringing women into engineering has also created all these new perspectives where somebody, I don't know this whole history, but maybe you know it a little bit better, that the robot was designed by a woman engineer, right? And how when this is another thing that people talked about a lot was having a microphone inside the robot was this engineering feature that was only there because it was a woman who designed the platform, right? And that gives them this security in the operating room that everyone can hear them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just think that that's like amazing that with the same time as like women being more prevalent in surgical fields, there are also women in the engineering
Engineering, yeah.
firms, like thinking about, oh, maybe there's not only one type of surgeon, or maybe there do need to be some different sizes or shapes of things for different people.
Yeah. And we all know that diversity of perspectives, right?
Yeah.
Only brings more innovation and more improvements. And I just learned something new from you. I did not know that the voice feature was the brainchild of a female engineer on the robot. So,
I'm gonna have to like check myself on that, but that's somebody did tell me that, and I like the story. So
yeah.
in any case, whoever did it did a great service to a lot of women, because it is, people find it very useful to not have to shout and to make sure that they're heard.
That they're heard. Yeah. I also kind of wanted to discuss something with you. I made notes when I was watching the film, and this other piece also kind of stayed with me that, data now shows, I mean, there are plenty of studies showing that women physicians, not just women surgeons, but women physicians, including surgeons, have better outcomes, spend a lot of time, with their patients, whether the outcomes are a result of that or, multiple other factors. It's probably multifactorial. But there is that data, and it got me thinking as I was looking at kind of that glove and instrumentation piece too. I'm like, we don't even have the right instruments that we need to do this work, and our outcomes are better. Imagine what would happen to everyone, the
Right.
safety in the operating room, how we do things, outcomes. Imagine the change that might come about if we actually had the ability, as one of the surgeons said in the film, to adapt to the diversity of the entire surgical workforce today, right? Think about the implications of that.
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, there's like a little bit of older literature about how cardiologists also, if there's a group of all male cardiologists, they may not be as good at taking care of women's cardiac issues. But as soon as
Right.
they have like one woman cardiologist in their group, the entire group gets better.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, I mean, that's important. And I'm just going to say it again because I think it's really important. I think the purpose of the film is not to be bashing on any group or negative towards anybody, but just sort of have us have an honest conversation
Right.
about how we can do things better
Hmm.
if we let go of some of our preconceived notions about who should be doing what in what circumstance.
Right. No, that is absolutely, well said. And I will second that as well when I said sort of, the literature showing sort of safety and outcomes. It applies to any sort of, team diversity, right? Like when you have multiple opinions and different perspectives at looking at a problem, it kind of elevates the whole boat. So, Sarah, I have, another question for you as it pertains to kind of, since we're talking about kind of making the instrumentation more inclusive. So it was really fascinating to me when I heard from, just our previous Society of Surgical Ergonomics president, Dr. Susan Hallbeck, who you've also met. She kind of explained to me how glove size, is actually a proxy for hand size, because glove size is actually just based on the length of the finger and not kind of all the other things. And so she devised, and as part of the Society of Surgical Ergonomics, we've been conducting this hand size study to better inform future instrument design, right? We're hoping to capture the diversity of the current surgical workforce. So we've been at various surgical meetings, taking measurements of hands of trainees, fellows, attending surgeons, and recording their grip strengths, and then kind of trying to correlate these things. And I think we shared some of that data. Susan shared that data in the first episode of the podcast with me, as well as in that webinar that I'm going to provide a link to that we did in December. What were your thoughts on that hand size data collection and study now that you have this perspective from your filmmaking?
Yeah. I mean, I just think it's like so incredible that it's 2025. Like, I mean, there's like surgical instruments have been used in the modern era for like, I don't know what, 150 years. And we're only now trying to capture what an average hand size is. It's like we made these, it's so amazing to me. Like we made all these assumptions for so many things in the operating room about who the surgeon was going to be and what they were going to look like. And I think it's so cool that someone is doing that. And I also think it's so insane that no one's ever done that before, right? Like you would think that to make an instrument that has to be done, that is hand controlled, that you would want to know sort of the range of sizes of the user. So
Yeah.
we have all these blind spots, I think, and I am always amazed when somebody's creative and innovative in a new way and to see into one of those blind spots.
I appreciate your perspective on this, and you're absolutely right. I remember asking Susan when she first proposed the idea of the study. I said, "What are they using to design the instruments right now? What have they been
Yeah.
using for years?" And I can't remember if she said this or somebody else on that call said this, but I think I've heard various versions. Like maybe there's a proprietary data
Oh,
set, or there is whether, and maybe it represents the general population from
yeah,
anthropometric data from 50 years ago. But who knows if, people who choose to go into surgery and
yeah,
surgical specialties have the same hand measurements as
I
people
know.
who chose to become firefighters,
I know.
So whatever this data is, clearly it doesn't match the current workforce, and hence this work is very important, right?
Yeah. I mean,
So,
it's like Halstead's hand or something that we're
I
still
mean,
using today.
I I don't, as I said, clearly, my first question was, what do you mean? Whose hand size is being used to
Yeah.
design things? Anyway, this is so wonderful again to have you here and chat about the film and kind of your path. And clearly it's a passion project, and it's
Yeah.
very apparent when you watch the film that it's very much a passion project for you. And I'm so glad that you've made this kind of glimpse into a surgeon's life. And I love the fact that you opened that film with that particular riddle, right? And that it's been part of so many TV shows where, a child has been in an accident and a parent has brought them to the hospital and they call for the surgeon, and the surgeon says, "I cannot operate on this child because this is my child," right? "Oh,
Yeah.
this is my son." And it takes forever for people to clue in, and sometimes they still don't clue in that the surgeon is a woman. It's the child's mother.
Yeah. Well,
So,
like, I thought a lot about, for those people who haven't watched the film,
yeah,
like, we talk a lot about 1972, which was the year that I was born and the greatest year. And then because of the legislation, Title IX, that
yeah, yeah.
that bans gender discrimination in higher education, and how that really affected the physician workforce.
Hmm.
And that joke has been told, and we start the joke being told in the 70s, and
Yes.
then all the way to today, the joke
Yeah.
is still, it's not a joke, it's a riddle really, but the riddle is still relevant. I wanted to say in a way like we've come so far, but we still have these remnants that are with us that are worth reevaluating.
Yeah. And we're in a process of evolution. And, I'm
Yeah.
just so delighted that this part, the fact that we have all this focus now on wellness and particularly ergonomics can only be, beneficial for the surgical and procedural community. But ultimately, in the end, our patients will benefit, right?
Yeah.
I do want to ask one other question because, maybe it's just pure curiosity on my part. I've heard of death by a thousand cuts. Now, you have to remember, I didn't grow up in North America, so it took me a while to understand these American sayings and idioms and, slang. I should say Canadian first, then I had to learn some American ones. So I heard of by a thousand cuts before. How did you come upon this title, Thousand and One Cuts? Is there a particular significance to that? Or is it just that I missed some other, term in my long-standing education on American slang
Yeah.
and idioms?
No, no, no. When I in 2020 when this project started, I had never made a film before, so I got a lot of advice on filmmaking from a lot of people. And the number one thing that people told me was you can't make a film that's all doom and gloom. There has to be a glimmer of hope at the end.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and I think at the time that I started, I sort of felt a little gloomy, maybe. And
Didn't we
um,
all? It was, 2021. Yeah.
yeah, and I really wanted in the film to convey this idea of it's not just one thing that brings frustration to women who are surgeons. It's not just one act because we're
Hmm.
all resilient and we can overcome things. That the way that you lose women from the surgical field or, is really through the accumulation of multiple small events that happen day in and day out. And I really struggled to find a way to make that hopeful or turn it around into a positive message. And so we ended up calling it 1001 Cuts because of Scheherazade and how she saved her life through storytelling. And this felt like an opportunity to, at least, even if we don't save the culture of surgery for women, at least we've told the story and we've had an opportunity to have a conversation. So it is a nod to women as storytellers.
Oh, this is awesome. This is a wonderful reference, and thank you for sharing that. I will add that there is it just occurred to me as you were speaking about it that, in the Indian culture, when we are giving money
Oh, yeah,
for
yeah.
auspicious occasions, so if it's a wedding, it's a birthday, whatever, we always add a plus one.
$1.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you've seen that too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So I've grown up with that, and I still do that. I remember when I put the offer on my house, I added a one to that, and I
I
had to
love
explain that to my real estate agent. But I think this is truly then you've named the film on a positive, hopeful note, even among those of us from the Indian culture, because it's a message of optimism and
Yeah,
the auspicious nature of this film that
it's
you've
a
added
gift.
one to the end. It's a gift, exactly. So,
Yeah.
on that note, thank you once again for being on our show and for being so invested in the work that you do. And I look forward to chatting with you again another time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on social media. Instagram, X, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We love feedback, so please reach out to us for topics, ideas, speakers, or if you ever want to be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.